Welcome to Onestus, and welcome to the first episode of my Uprooting Passion series in 2025. I am so incredibly grateful and excited to be here today with you, Alex, to talk about your new book, Breakfast Wine. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited that you want to talk about the book and, the issues around the book and I think our shared interests. So very, very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Yes, likewise. And I just want to say, like, it's very surreal for me because the way that we met was because I looked up to you as a digital storyteller and impact. And so it feels very surreal to be sharing your story and your book. So thank you again so much. And
Pleasure.
I'm so excited about Breakfast Wine, and I haven't even read it yet. So please tell me where I can buy it and when, so others can know as well.
Thank you. Well, this is my ARC. It comes out, that's an advanced review copy for people who may not speak the lingo of the publishing world. So it's a really exciting time for authors. They get to see the physical manifestation of their book. And it's a time where you're sending it out to try to get reviews and get on podcasts and get blurbs. And you're also proofreading it because no matter how many times you read it, you've missed errors. And
Mhm.
so it's a time to have another comb through and try to fix up all the editorial mistakes. But the book comes out June 10th on Apprentice House Press. So you can find it on bookshop.org. And you can also pre-order it on Amazon, or you can pre-order it from a local indie bookstore, which would be my preference, or through bookshop.org, just to keep, bookstores alive. And it's important to pre-order. It helps writers' books kind of come to the top of rankings so more people will get to see them. So if people can pre-order, thank you. If not, I understand.
Awesome. I will put links in the description for everything so that way people can pre-order and read the amazing summary of this book. And the first thing I wanted to ask you before diving into your story and the book is, where does the name or the title Breakfast Wine come from?
Oh, for friends and people who are fans of true crime, there's a great podcast called My Favorite Murder. That's a true crime comedy podcast from Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. And breakfast wine was a term they coined, I think, on episode 75. So it was a joke, and I love it. To me, it sort of brings to mind Dionysus and a little bit of like Greek mythology. There was a fair amount of drinking when we lived in Iraq. And it's just kind of punchy and fun. So I decided I would use it. It fits one of the stories in the memoir, so it works.
Great. And just jumping in now in Onestus, uprooting passion fashion, excuse the rhyme. Um, your summary of the book, I mean, it takes you on so many turns and it's just a little blurb about it and it sucks you in. And you share all these personal experiences, and at the end, you talk about finding a way home. What is home?
So the memoir is about my near decade spent in northern Iraq, mostly teaching and then also volunteering in humanitarian aid organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to braid the geopolitical and the personal. So you get a lot of Iraq and Kurdish history, topography, culture, and then you get the stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's for me, I'm constantly wrestling with myself, this thirst to live among travelers and adventurers, and then also the very real desire to form community and set roots down somewhere. And so I had gone abroad trying to find meaning and purpose and camaraderie. And I never thought the US would be a place that I would return to. And so woven throughout the narrative, I think, are stories of placement and displacement and what ties us to a place and what tethers us from it. My father passed during the time of this book, and my father was a refugee from a war-torn country who, made a very comfortable middle-class living for himself in the United States and loved and breathed American exceptionalism. And I kind of grew up with that doctrine. And it was reflexive of the belief in it, kind of like, my belief in God from being brought up Catholic. And it wasn't until I started to live abroad and outside of my own culture that I saw America from the outside looking in and became disabused of this idea of American exceptionalism. And so my father and I would often clash politically when we would talk about, immigration or war or drivers of violent conflict. But when he passed, it was a reason to come back, and his passing was a real untethering. And this question comes up many times in the memoir, especially through the lens of my adult students who had lived through the United States invasion of Iraq, and then, ISIS destroying their homes in the South, and then my students that were Syrian Kurds that had been displaced from like Kobani and that area. My Yazidi students who had also been displaced by ISIS. And it's this question of like, what ties you to a place? Is home just a construct to hold on to, or is it a construct to let go of? Because there's, a spectrum of perspectives from my students, from their lived experiences, and then my own. Like I was very anxious to kind of live outside my culture, and then with his passing, found that I wanted to kind of go back. And then what that going back is like, it's a feeling of you see things and they're familiar, but you can't quite figure out what they are.
Yeah.
So it's all that wrapped up, much more eloquently because I had time to write it and think about it.
And I'm curious, where was your father from?
He was a Berliner, and when he was like 5, World War II was raging, and my grandmother, like many German women did, boarded him outside the city on a farm. So you're like 5 years old and you're living among strangers without your parents, which is already difficult. And he remembers like running through this field at the farm, trying to get to the farmhouse, and the Allied forces were strafing the field. And then when they came to the United States, it was 1947, and Germans weren't allowed to have foreign currency. My grandmother had these gold rim plates, and they had like a camera. And my dad bought some currency on the black market and folded it into where the film would be on the camera. And they came over on the SS Harlan, I think it was. And they sold that to have money to live on. And my dad had to go to night school to learn English, and then he put himself through Northwestern. And he really is, the epitome of American self-reliance and that by your bootstrap kind of Horatio Alger theory or story that we all learn in social studies. But I personally don't think it's as accessible today. I think the world today is very different than the United States that he emigrated to in 1947. So I think, my life, I have not planned anything in my life, but looking back as this memoir has forced me to do, there is a logical sense to it, given his background, his story, his deep commitment to social justice issues, and the way that he lived his life. Like, he wasn't particularly religious, but he was the kind of person that believed in ethics and fairness, and how you conducted yourself every day when no one was looking mattered. And from him, it's my work ethic.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're cleaning the floor or running a company. It's a privilege to have a job, and you do it to the best of your ability. And so I feel like looking back now, my life makes a little bit more sense, or at least the last part of it. I had a very selfish existence in the middle. After university, I had a corporate job, which I disliked. And then I decided I wanted to be an actor, having never been on stage before. And I was an actor in New York for over a decade. And then I wanted to live outside of my culture. And then I thought, I want to get into humanitarian aid work. I had read this book, Emergency Sex and Other Desperate Measures, and it really kind of set me on a path. And I couldn't get a job. There was no transferable skill set. So I certified to teach, and I went abroad and started volunteering. And then I ended up getting a position with a small NGO that was acquired by a larger implementing partner, and then finally with a major international development organization. So there's so much luck involved in all those junctures. But there is like a through line that's, for me, very much based in like the family lore.
Yeah. So I was curious if what you are doing now and what you have been doing, were there traces of that early on before you got into your career?
No. When I was still an actor, I was working on a film written and directed by this woman named Larissa Kondracki. And she was working on another screenplay, which later became The Whistleblower with Vanessa Redgrave and Rachel Weisz. So Larissa wrote and directed that. And while we were filming, we did a 30-minute film. She had me read that script, and I found it fascinating. It's all about this police officer, a real life person named Kathy Volkovac. And she decides to join the UN. They need peacekeepers in Bosnia right after the Balkan War. And she's the whistleblower that talks about UN complicity in trafficking. Mm-hmm. And I found the screenplay fascinating, so I started reading all of her source material. And it was really like this journey through books that set me on this different path in my life. And then I was really fortunate to meet people who were generous with their time, which is why when you contacted me on LinkedIn, I was like, of course I'll talk to you, because I've been so lucky. People have done that for me throughout my career. And you don't know how a conversation will really kind of change your trajectory. So, no, my life was really selfish, I think. Like when I was an actor, we were just partying and waiting tables and hanging out and auditioning all the time and sometimes performing. It was fun. I read a lot more then than I do now, because you have time to read.
Yeah.
And I'd never give up those years in my life. I mean, actor training is so useful for life, because for me, I think I was really not that shy in front of people, but I'm a very confident and competent public speaker. A lot of that's actor training. It teaches you too things like, there's a lot of vocal work and breath control, but you can hear when someone's not on their breath. That usually means they're, one, not being truthful, or two, they're insecure or something. So like, women often go up in here and they get pitch raised. And if I'm talking to someone and they do that, then I'm like, oh, I'm doing something that's making them uncomfortable. And it just sharpened my emotional intelligence, which was so useful as an educator. And then the observation skills that you hone in actor training were completely useful as an educator, because I could very readily identify where someone's learning challenge was and address it, because I had been trained to observe through all that actor training and then experience. So the training has been intrinsic in all parts of my career. And being a storyteller, so my first full-time job with an NGO was as a staff writer for an NGO called Preemptive Love, and they wanted someone who could fictionalize from facts, which was what my literary fiction, my earlier book had done. So I can do the research and then take the research and create a story that's going to make you viscerally feel something, so I don't have to like didactically tell you. In which they wanted that particular skill for some of the content they were creating.
Nice. And I like what you mentioned about how one conversation can just change the trajectory of your life. And that's what this book seems to very much so be about. Can you talk about that conversation with that journalist, or the acclaimed journalist who presented this opportunity? What was going on?
I love Jerry. It's Jerry Van Dyke. He's written many, many things. So I met him at a book signing for his book called Captive. He had been kidnapped by the Taliban and held for 40-something days, I think, and written a book about it. When I met him at a reading, and so I had him sign my book, and I asked him a couple of questions, and we became friends, and he became like a mentor to me. And he was very instrumental in encouraging me to go to Iraq, northern Iraq, for my first teaching assignment there. He's just like my favorite person to have a meal with, because his stories are incredible. I mean, he's an incredible human being. He was an Olympic caliber runner. And so the year that the US didn't participate in the Olympics, he was on Steve Prefontaine's team at the Leningrad Games. And there's a photo of him right behind Steve, like with the American flag.
Wow.
So he's all that, and then also this acclaimed journalist. And so he embedded as a stringer in the 1980s with the Mujahideen, back when Haqqani was a friend of the United States, like the Charlie Wilson War era. And he wrote a book called In Afghanistan about it. And that cemented his career as a journalist. And he went on to work for National Geographic for a few decades with CBS News. He was consulted on Charlie Wilson's war. He, is the authority on everything Pashtun, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I remember him telling me in 2010, 11, that he thought Osama bin Laden was hiding out in Pakistan. He knew then. He's just an incredible person, and he encouraged me to keep writing, and he encouraged me to go to Northern Iraq, which turned out to be just the best decision I have ever made. And I made it, I joke in the memoir, equal parts curiosity and desperation. Like, I was at a dead-end job. I wasn't making enough money to even have health insurance. I was back waiting tables at this unglamorous restaurant on the Upper West Side, where everyone thought I was an ICE agent undercover. I couldn't figure out why I was working there. And I was just lost. And so I went, and it changed everything. I had enough money so I could continue writing classes, because I didn't start writing till 2010. And then I started taking classes at the Writers Studio in New York, which I highly recommend. Everything I know about writing, I learned there. And then they had classes online, so I continued when I went to Northern Iraq. And, from there, I saved enough money to go to grad school, and then I could get a job at a university. I started writing. I had my first book published. And, the teaching career took off. I was speaking at conferences and doing cool things like training teachers for the Ministry of Higher Education in Baghdad. Like, none of that would have ever happened if I hadn't gone to the International High School in Erbil, where I had the first teaching job.
And was this the first time you lived abroad?
No. I had lived in Poland, Turkey, and Ukraine prior teaching. So I went to Poland in 2006, and from there I went to Turkey till 2008. Then I came back to the States for a bit, and within that same year I was out to Ukraine again and spent 2 years there. Then I came back and was a year and changed back in New York, and then I went to Northern Iraq. And I was in Germany for 2 years. The first time I was in Northern Iraq, I did a summer education program in the West Bank. Then I went to Germany, then I went back to Northern Iraq for 6 years. And that 6-year stint was at a different city where I taught at a university, because at that point I had my master's. And that was great because I had, my first book was just getting published. I was starting to win awards for writing. I started to apply to writer residencies. And so one summer I went to Sevilla, Spain for a month because I loved it. And then from there I went down to Panama to train teachers for a State Department program. And then I went back to Northern Iraq. And then the next year I had an art residency outside Barcelona. And, it was just great. The next year I had one in Cadiz in the south of Spain. So it was just a wonderful time. There's so much privilege, which doesn't escape me. I'm an expat in these contexts. I'm not considered an economic migrant, even though technically I am. I went abroad to have a better job and to make money. In the beginning, that's what it was about. But I fell in love with teaching. I think I'm a better teacher actually than writer. I had a real sense of purpose.
Yes.
Which is another theme throughout the memoir, is finding purpose and meaning. And there's a philosopher who says, you find your purpose where you find your great joy, where it meets the world's great need. And I was finding that in these classrooms in Northern Iraq, but it wasn't a place to drop anchor and have a life. And so as I'm getting ready to return to the United States, there's this, feeling of kind of panic, like, what am I doing? I'm starting over in a new career now. I'm old. I was in my 50s at that point, and I had great joy in these classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the students were amazing. I would say COVID really kind of changed things. But until that point, I just had such great joy with my Kurdish and Iraqi and Assyrian students. They're just amazing, amazing. And I don't know, they just taught me a lot.
Yeah. How did your understanding of these cultures evolve from day one to when you were leaving?
I'm hoping that people read the memoir and walk away seeing a few things. That the quote unquote people over there are just like us, that they want the same chances for education and they want to live with peace and safety and security. For me, it was heart broadening in the sense I had students who were 12 or 13 during the invasion, and they have their stories from that time. And they've seen horrific, war created violence. And yet, then in their 20s, they don't know how to ask a girl out for coffee. And that juxtaposition is heartbreaking. And that they're living, post ISIS, they're coming to the university on very generous scholarships that the school opened up to bring people to safety. But their families are still in camps. And there's never any, feel sorry for me. There's so much resilience. And there's just this capacity for joy, even though they've already seen and experienced horrific violence in their lives. And I'm always struck by how they didn't hate Americans or they didn't hate me when, my country basically broke there. Or in some instances, they saw house raids gone awry and family members killed in front of their eyes. And, because of my birth gifts, because I'm white and I was born into a middle class home in the United States, I don't know those realities. My father did. My students do. And I didn't do anything to earn the privilege of not knowing it. And so that flip, I always say, like, living abroad in these cultures made me a nicer person, or, a more empathetic for sure, and more generous, and much more, I have a better ability to consider other possibilities. Like, when you think someone might be slighting you or you think something's wrong, it's like, go widen that lens. There's maybe other things going on.
I think that's really huge, widening the lens. And yeah, that's something really big that I've learned in my short time in conflict resolution, is to meet people where they're at. And I also just want to go back for a moment, because you mentioned earlier in our talk these periods of selfishness in your life. But teaching is like the most selfless thing you can do. It's truly the way that you give back. And so
Not when I was a teacher.
you needed that experience to get to, like you said, to kind of take on those skills to be the great teacher that you are.
Well, thanks. I'm not going to lie. Living in New York then was great. We were living the Sex and the City life when the Sex and the City life was on television.
That's great, yeah.
So often friends of mine in my acting classes would bring in their audition sides for the show. And it was, I'll never trade that. It was before Williamsburg had hyper gentrified, and you could still, when we first moved there in the mid 90s, it was like, there were still sex workers on North 3rd Street. There was 2 bars, it was, and then it, within 10 years, it had become just a really fun, hip, still very artistic place where you could see like an old Polish couple walking down the street on the way to Greenpoint. And you still had Hispanic families that own their stores and their bodegas off of Bedford Avenue. And then by the time I had come back after Poland, Turkey, and Ukraine, I remember these bodega owners that were off Bedford and Third. I was living by the JMZ. I was like on the other side of Williamsburg, because we're priced out of this very hip neighborhood. And they had two, and they had another bodega by the JMZ. And they're like, "Hey, you're back."
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
So I would never give up any of those experiences. Some of my closest friendships are all from this bar we worked at. There was like no turnover for the first few years. The owners were awesome. It's called the Divine Bar. It was like one of the first wine bars with sample glass bottles and flights. And we just spent like all our nights together when we weren't doing plays. You'd work, you'd bank a lot of money, then you'd get a play. If you covered your shifts, the owners let you keep your job. And then you'd go do your play, you'd be poor again, and you'd come back and you'd work. And it was fun. It was really fun. And there are a lot of people I work with who stayed as actors and have great careers. And it's fun to see them so successful. And it's also, they're deep friendships because you spent so much time together.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty in acting where you never know where your next gig is going to come from. So do you feel like you became really comfortable with uncertainty in that?
I never thought about it that way. I think, when I tell people when I tell my friends I don't like change, they always laugh in my face because, I've lived in a lot of places and do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But I think what really scares me is not trying things that I'm galvanized toward out of fear. Like I hate that I'm picking up more fears as I get older. Like I feel like I was so fearless at 10, and then puberty hit, and I went through that phase of ugly awkwardness, or like my nose grew and my face needed a couple years to catch up to it. And those years are hard. Like kids are mean in those years, boys are mean, there's bullying. And then when I came out of it, I didn't bring any of that confidence with me. Mm-hmm. And I find that I'm, more shy in certain situations. And I don't like that. I would like to get rid of and abandon these fears. So I think it wasn't the uncertainty that makes me scared as much as the idea that I'm going to live my life and really regret not doing X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, your memoir, everything you've done, you couldn't possibly have any regrets.
I have tons of regrets. Tons. Yeah. I have tons. I wish I had taken myself more serious as an actor. I think I always assumed I would fail. And so, like, I remember going to a big open call and getting a call back for Actors Theater Louisville, which was a great, apprenticeship program at the time. And I didn't pursue it because I was like, oh, I better finish my training at Circle in the Square and get the degree. And I just colored so only in the lines. Mm-hmm. And now I look at those kinds of decisions and I hate that I made them, and they were fear-based. And I hate the decisions I regret are the ones that were made out of fear. Which is why in our current predicament, I'm not jumping to go move to a different location because I might lose my job. I'm really determined not to make another fear-based decision.
What you're saying, I think, is also extremely refreshing because most people would never think twice to leave their hometown or do anything out of the ordinary, yet alone move to another country or move to a war zone. And to hear you say that you have fears and regrets, I think is very refreshing.
I am the biggest scaredy cat about insects. Ask anyone who knows me. I have people on call in my building that I can call if I see something that needs to come before me. But so I definitely have the fears, and I definitely have the regrets. I definitely have regrets. I know that's, I mean, part of, I think, the process of living.
Yeah.
But there's nothing wrong with staying where you are your whole life if that's what you want. I mean, I'm really fortunate that my life worked out, but there was no guarantee that was going to happen, and it's scary. I didn't have health insurance for the majority of my adult life. Um, there's I'm probably not in a great situation for retirement. I probably won't be able to retire in the U.S. I never married or had children. And the children thing was choice. The married thing, I have been engaged, but I've never been married. Also because, women, we're socialized to build our lives around our partners, so at their convenience, because they typically make more money and they have better insurance packages, etc. And if I had married at any of the times I'd been engaged, I would have never had this like Iraq act, this second act. And it's been so fruitful. There's no way I would have wanted another set of choices, but it comes at a price. I wish there's no control group for life. I would love to like be the sky so that I could be everywhere all at once, but that's not how reality works. And so, and then again, I go back to the gratitude and think about my students' generosity and resilience, and I realize if I'm about to complain, I should shut my mouth.
Yeah. I like what you said, like to think or wish that you could be the sky. I always think of sometimes like life is like we're in a movie theater and we're all watching this movie, but we're all in a different seat from infinitely different angles, and you'll never know until you are in that seat or that other person's seat that you'll really know that angle or view. So, yeah.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you. And so you mentioned in your memoir summary just all these experiences that had my eyebrows raised. And I'm someone that like genuinely I don't get surprised or like it's kind of hard for me to get excited or surprised. It genuinely was raising my eyebrows, and from dining with a hitman to humanitarian aid drops. And how did these experiences change you, and maybe how did they not change you?
The pistol packing hitman was funny because so we're in this like nightclub in Erbil, and there's a gun check, and he's got, first he looks like he's an extra from The Sopranos. He's bigger, he's got dark hair, he's got a three-piece suit on, and he opens up his double-breasted suit jacket, and there's a gun in each pocket. So he has wasta. So he's got the power of somebody that he doesn't have to follow the rules. He gets to carry his guns in.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and this guy, he was a rumored hitman. So I have to preface that. He was a rumored hitman for a political party that was quite powerful. True, not true? I don't know. Why does he have two guns in his, most people have a Kalashnikov rifle in their car, but they don't have two pistols in a jacket they're wearing into a nightclub.
Okay.
And then the second thing was, I love this. He was in law school also, which I'm like, you can't make this up. So we're sitting there.
Support himself,
I'm sitting with a government minister on Christian affairs and his brother and this rumored hitman, and we're like drinking tequila and they're smoking a shisha pipe, and the rumored hitman starts talking about how his wife, who looks exactly like Angelina Jolie, and he's tired of having sex with her, but of course he uses the F word. And it's like, it just to me it's so typical. This idea that no matter how beautiful or young or whatever your partner looks like, there's going to be some dude that's going to say he's tired of effing her. And that seems to be universal culture to culture. So sometimes it didn't, change me at all. But this government minister introduced me to someone else who was a Syrian from Baghdad, and he accompanied, allegedly, Masoud Barzani and snuck him into Iran to avoid being imprisoned at one point when he was challenging Saddam Hussein. This is way before the autonomous region of Kurdistan had been formed. And so this guy had also great stories about like falling in love with female resistance fighters and like all the countries he had spent prison time in for his political beliefs or being like against the current government in power. And so he really romanticized them, and they were fun to listen to. But it was insightful to know that this idea of a repressive regime under Saddam Hussein, it was repressive in terms of human rights and governance, but it wasn't necessarily repressive in terms of how people live day to day. You know, I mean, Jerry Van Dyke says this about Kabul in his book, that in the 60s, you could see women in knee socks and miniskirts in Kabul.
Yeah.
So to be reminded that the current repression of human rights wasn't always it's not a singular story. They didn't always live that reality. And then it was heartbreaking to hear Assyrians, as well as Kurds at different times, long for the days of Saddam, because at that point, the Iraqi government was failing to provide essential services, and they wanted some organization. They wanted consistent electricity and running water and garbage collection. And to hear that was like heartbreaking. But as we move into our upcoming change of administration, I'm wondering how much historical repetition we'll see in terms of, repression of journalists, or are we going to become like a Hungary where there's just like this veneer of a democracy, but our elections are no longer free or fair, or our judiciary has been so corrupted that the democratic guardrails are gone, and there aren't going to be a free press or independent journalists to keep us informed. And then because there's so much misdis and malinformation, it's who's going to believe what. Like we already don't share the same set of facts or listen to the same news. And to me, I just see this hyperpolarization and breakdown of social cohesion here that I'm wondering, are we going to, where people broke into sectarian camps, are we going to further polarize along strict ideological lines? And that to me is a very scary reality to contemplate.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we talked about, there's so much unknown with what's to come. And I think it's interesting how you draw these parallels, because I think before, like even for me myself, not living abroad much, you sometimes in America don't think that these things can happen to you, or you think that you're different or above a lot of these issues, and fail to realize that a lot of it's happening under your nose already.
Listening to the Pete Hegseth hearings, I was like, I feel like I'm listening to Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, in the sense that women who had credibly accused both men of sexual misconduct aren't even being interviewed by the FBI. We're not even getting to hear their stories. There's no investigation. And it's like we learn nothing.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there'll be challenging moments ahead. And yeah. No, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong on all accounts.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so on those, what was really interesting, just to circle back to your question of like how those experiences changed me or didn't change me. Mm-hmm. So the pistol packing hitman and the other dude, not so much. Besides having a very entertaining night and hearing some great stories, yeah, not so moved. But going into the refugee camps was different. So this section of the memoir where I talk about volunteering with different humanitarian aid organizations, there are like 3 or 4 instances that I thematically put together through this lens of camps and campings. And so the first time, there was this guy that I worked with at a different school, and he wanted to start like a DIY humanitarian aid to cut through the red tape. At that point, the Kurdish region was really in flux. We were getting so many Syrian Kurdish refugees because the Syrian civil war kicked off. And it was just really hard to organize, not to shade any of the humanitarian aid organizations. It was just, the situation was so fluid. It was, the data, within a week would be obsolete. Like, who's coming in? Where are they? What do we need? Where are they staying? How are we going to get services to them, for example, like when I'm talking about data. And so we tried to do it on our own. And I remember, we had these 2 aid drops, and they don't go well. A lot of things go wrong because despite our best intentions, we didn't do it very well. And then the next time I'm out, I'm volunteering with Acted, this French NGO. And we're trying to ascertain how many people are living in these buildings, again, so that we know, so this data gets reported up so agencies know where to deploy resources. And we just knock on this door, and these like Syrian Kurdish young guys like welcome us in. They have like nothing, and they make us tea, and it takes a little bit for them to open up. They don't want to give us too much information. Who knows if they came in legally or illegally? We don't care. We're not here to talk about that. We're here to tell them where they can get services, and we want to see how many people are in each unit. And their generosity when they had so little. I remember being very struck by that. And so, in my mind, and I think this is a normal reaction, you're confronted with a situation you haven't seen before, and you measure it to what you know. And so I'm trying to think, like, what was their, they were loosely related, probably from the same village. Did their mom pack them food to go? But and I'm like romanticizing it, and then I catch myself romanticizing it. Like, this isn't. I have no idea what their lived reality is, because again, of my birth gifts, I'm lucky that I don't know. And then by the end of the day, they're very generous and very kind to us. So then the next humanitarian aid situation that I talk about is I had gone out with Acted again, and we were mapping the Domus refugee camp at that point. It was quite famous. Angelina Jolie had already been there. The camp was overcrowded. They had to put in a new section just for men because there were cases of sexual misconduct within the refugee camps. And we were there to like map it, which means you're marking like water points and latrines and small businesses. So, and a lot of times people think, oh, if you're in a refugee camp, you get everything. You don't. There also, you have international refugee camps, you have settlements, which aren't under the guardship of like a major organization like UNHCR. So those kind of settlements, there's more freedom of movement, so refugees can go and find work, but there are far less services provided. And so you still need money to do things. Like, you need internet. So you might need an internet dish, or you have to like buy data. You're not always going to have all your food and water requirements met. So people start small businesses within the camp. And then this idea that the camps are temporary. I think the average stay in a camp is like 17 years. The World Bank has some statistic on it. It's quite long. And you've got this rhythm and cycle of life going on. You have, weddings. Children are born, and people want to celebrate because they want some sense of normalcy in their lives when they're living within so much disruption. And so I didn't realize any of that until I went. And then, there was a cholera outbreak in the camp, and we happened to go at Eid, and everyone's lined up at the barber shop. They want to get the shave and be groomed before they go to Paris for Eid. And they're trying to give us some candy because it was the sugar Eid. And again, this generosity, this resilience. And I remember running into a colleague from the international high school, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" And it's like, for reasons I'll never understand, we weren't supposed to volunteer with organizations outside of the school. So I was like afraid that I was going to get caught. And I was trying to keep it vague. I had no idea that faculty members had family living in these camps. So that was like a huge realization. And just, we chose not to eat in the camp because of the cholera outbreak, to eat at one of the restaurants, which probably should have been what we had done because it would have boosted the local economy. But we left and we went to the city, and, I was silently happy because I'd been holding my pee all day. I didn't want to use one of the latrines. I wanted, I wanted some plumbing.
Yeah.
So again, I'm just constantly reminded of my own privilege and shallowness. And so those trips to the aid camps really changed me. And then I was with these 3 aid workers who had amazing careers. They were really young. They'd worked in all these difficult contexts. And I realized, as much as I had romanticized that world and thought I wanted to be a part of it, I'm shallow. There are things about me that are shallow. I like plumbing. I like dry cleaning, and I'm not cut out for that. But I'm very effective in a classroom. And that specific time of going to the Dome's refugee camp really showed me, where my personal limitations were and how I could be most effective to the causes that I cared about. So it was like a little bit of a growing up. I've been romanticizing this idea of what it would be like to work in the field, and I had wanted to do it, and I realized, I'm just too shallow, and I was old at that point and speak languages, and and then the very last part of that section in the book, I realized that one of the guys I'd been in the field with that day and had a little mini crush on, he had been kidnapped by ISIS, and he was an Italian, and the Italian government, I think, paid a ransom because he was eventually freed, and it was, what that was about. And then at that point, I'd been living in Germany, and I'm trying to articulate all these feelings, and there's no one in my world that will understand them, because the experiences are so far removed from everyday experience that it rendered my experiences in northern Iraq rendered me more foreign in Germany than being an American who didn't speak German in Germany. And so it's just those kinds of realizations. And I remember going home, how big the houses are took on a whole new relevance. Or the first time you're in a supermarket and there are 30 cereals, and this overwhelming, almost like a panic attack. There's too much choice. And so it's really, it really changed my viewpoint in terms of consumption and capitalism and how we live when most of the world doesn't live that way. I'm not trying to say that I'm like Sister Mary Alex. I'm definitely still overconsumptive. I have way too many clothes. I still like antique jewelry. I'm not a great person, but it did shift my perspective. And I think that's the starting point to shift actions and behavior. So I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for the almost 10 years I spent there.
Say shallowness, and the way you were describing it to me, it sounded almost like humility, admitting I can't be this particular person I want to be, but I'm acknowledging it, and you seem to be in some ways okay with it, and that's I think that's very, very admirable, and that's probably why you're such a great teacher, because you're relatable, and if people can relate to you, they'll listen to you, and they'll really feel that.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's really important for calm. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I'm self-aware.
Yeah, self-aware. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And leading by example and being a teacher, that's the greatest lesson you could teach to the world in many ways, is to just say what you want to say, or, be who you, sounds very generic and basic, but you get what I'm saying, being authentic and being able to really speak to one another and hear one another. And you navigated all these challenges, and I'm just curious, what was your motivation? Did you have a motivation? Was there any specific reason, or?
So when I first went to teach abroad, it was 2006. It was January. I was taking over for a teacher who had been fired in Poland. And then from Poland, I went straight to Turkey. And it was more what am I going to do? Am I going to go back to New York? And I just didn't want to be an actor anymore. Like, I felt like I was doing someone a favor to audition. Please, like I wasn't a great actor. So there was no loss to the profession by not being an actor. And I just didn't know what to do. And so that's where the desperation comes from. Like, I have to do something. I'm old, because I 39, 40 when I went to Poland to teach for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Let me think. Yeah, it was 2006. So yeah, I was 39. And then that first teaching job was horrible. It was this tiny, town in Silesia, which like people in Warsaw call like the armpit of Poland, tiny coal mining town. And we were teaching at this language school, the Kalin method. And it was basically you're built on repetition. So this is a paper, this is a pen, is this a paper, is this a pen? And you couldn't point, it was culturally inappropriate to point, but you kind of karate chopped your hand, called on a student to be like, what's this? And hope that they would hear it rapid fire enough that they would be able to say pen. It was soul crushingly horrible. And so I made it through and somehow got a job at a school in Izmir in Turkey where I really learned how to teach. There were some great faculty members, really creative director of studies, learned how to teach, made some great friends. And it was hard. Like, I would go in on my days off. I didn't know how to lesson plan. I didn't know how to take it out of a book and make it interactive and like make the classroom part of the lesson in the sense that things are on the floor, they're on the walls, people are out of their chairs. You're like working with adults and you're making them play to learn. And that school was really big on that. And it was great training. It was great training. It was hard, but it made me a really good teacher. Mm-hmm. And then I took a job in Ankara because my Turkish boyfriend was supposed to be getting transferred, and then he didn't. And I did not like Ankara. And so I started not to like him either until we broke up. So I went back to New York for a little bit, and then I went to Ukraine for 2 years. And that was really fun. I didn't love Ukraine because I didn't love the weather. But it was the first time I lived in a context where I didn't have American friends. All my friends were Ukrainian. And I'm still friends with some folks from then, or I had one class of teenagers, and then the rest were adults, and like those teenagers are all now like in careers, have master's degrees, married with kids, which is lovely to see. And that was a fun experience. I had a lot of joy in those classrooms.
Yeah.
And then I came back to the States and was lost, that dead end job. And then I met Jerry and I decided to go abroad again. Like, I remember thinking, I was listening to his stories and I'm, trying to get my life together by the metrics of success of American culture, house, marriage, maybe children. And I'm like, just erecting that superstructure of normal life is not for me. And I'm like listening to his stories, hanging on every word. I was like, yeah, it's that constant yin yang push pull. Like, I do want to be out there and exploring, but I do want to build community as well and have some roots somewhere. And that's still an issue. Like, I was reconsidering the subtitle, although it's too late to change it on the book, but like finding a way home. I don't know. I'm restless. I don't feel at home. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'll ever feel at home anywhere. I'm perpetually restless.
I often think about that too and I tell people this and I think they think I'm crazy. When I was a kid, I would like sit in my childhood home and I can remember this feeling very vividly where I wanted to go home, but I was in my home, like very young. And I like had no sense of like where that home was. So I knew I needed to go somewhere. I don't know if you relate to that or understand that feeling at all. Yeah.
100%. It's the idea, like, I feel like that's why I have to always be in motion. Mm-hmm. And that's why, like, being a remote worker and sitting for the majority of my day,
Hmm.
my work is thought work, is not good for me because I perpetually need emotion.
Hmm.
Um, it's like a restlessness. I feel like a tumbleweed. And when my dad passed, that was, and I feel like such a baby because was lucky enough to have my dad for more than half my life. And it still rendered me immediately a child. And it was this like tethering of this construct of home. And like, we didn't have a great relationship because I was probably a little shit until I was like in my 30s. And I realized because he kept this letter, my mom showed it to me when, after he passed, where I had sent him Christmas presents and they were books. And I was like, oh, I hope you opened the gifts before the card. I got your book. I didn't know what to get you. And I don't like that I don't know you well enough to know what to get you. And I want to change that. And so I spent like the next 20 years doing that, actively doing that. And I thought, when he passed, that I wouldn't have any regrets. Wow, was I wrong? And wow, was I unprepared? And it was such a tethering. Like the night he passed, I put every stuffed animal in Puppet. I have these puppets that I have had from childhood. Everybody slept in the bed with me. Like it rendered me a child. And then but still no place felt like home. And I don't know what that, I also think it's weird. Like I've never created a home with someone that was sustaining. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know what defines this construct of home. Like I had this student and his father had this family compound that he had spent like over a decade building in Anbar, in the Anbar province, and ISIS like took it over. And there was like nothing left of this home. And like my student was living in Sulaymaniyah in the north, going to university. And I remember him telling me, he's like, I look out the windows, the streets are quiet, it's safe, there are the mountains. Like, why would I ever want to leave them? And his father had gotten out, which was not easy because his father had worked for the UN and ISIS kept a detailed database. And like they basically had to leave with nothing. They couldn't look like they were leaving, holding their breath through checkpoints and, got out. And he had rebuilt a life in the north. But then after, ISIS was gone out of Anbar, the government said you have to go back to get like this supplementary pension that he needed to live on. He was a teacher, but he needed it as well. And like you're forced to go back home, whereas, they didn't want to go back. Like, what is there to go back for? So that's for me what was one of those motivations behind declaring like, is home this construct that you're always trying to leave or a place that you hang on to at all costs? Because of the different stories my students shared with me.
Yeah. It really is like, I honestly haven't thought about it too much until this conversation, that it's really hard to define home. Um, I think I have many friends that are refugees. And I think family tends to be something that feels like home a lot, or people in general can feel like home. But it's really hard to pinpoint. I'm just curious, by the way, have you been to where your father grew up? Yeah.
We, we, I would always ask him to talk about his past. You can tell I'm not used to wearing earphones.
Mhm.
And he was, reluctant to do it. There's, I'm a theme in the book is like how violence reverberates across a life. And when he was a child and he came of age, there wasn't a vocabulary around talking about mental health or the violence you've seen in process. And so we've developed that going forward, but we've had such atrocities in conflict. Like in Raqqa, kids were playing soccer, football, with human heads. We don't have practitioner information, methodologies, experience on helping that generation of kids heal from trauma. And the same in Gaza and the West Bank. So you think about how this violence reverberates across a life. And my dad was very reluctant to share his stories. And every year I would give him a recording device and ask him. And then in 2008, he took us all to Berlin. I flew in from Ankara. My sister and her husband and her son came from Seattle. My mom, my dad, and my other nephew from Chicago. And we all met, and he hired a van and a driver, and he took us everywhere that they had lived throughout the war, telling us a variety of stories, from East and West Berlin. It was crazy good. And then he was recording. He brought the recording devices. He's like, and I'll leave you in charge of this. And I couldn't believe he had hung on to them. And then my mom typed them all up and added photos and made these beautiful books. And it's in my fireproof bag because it's one of those can't lose this possession. So yeah, he finally did that in 2008. It was one of the best experiences. Yeah, it was remarkable.
When we started this conversation, you had mentioned some stories about him as a kid. Just sometimes in my head, I just remember saying running in a field, and that just sticks out to me. And then you were talking about how you always feel like you're running around. And you just told this incredible story about your dad. And just, I feel like to start wrapping up the interview and in this conversation, I can't imagine that your dad's not the most proud father of what you've done and what you are doing. And I think it's truly an honor to hear your story and to learn about your father too as well, because he sounds like he was a really incredible person.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And I personally think that your memoir is going to have a great impact. But how do you intend for your memoir to have an impact?
Well, people have to read it.
Yeah, absolutely.
My hope is that if you're a middle-aged person and you're thinking about shaking up your life, this would maybe encourage you to do it. I think it's important in our storytelling that we see ourselves or people who look like us so that we think we can do it too. And I want people to know that if they want to change their lives in a profound way, it's doable and you're probably going to be okay. And I want people who might not have a lot of empathy for refugees to maybe read the book and have a little perspective shift on what drives people to leave. It's not easy, obviously, to leave everything your community, language, education, everything you've spent your life trying to build, because of whatever factor, if it's exceptional poverty, violent conflict, has made it so bad to be there that you're willing to risk your life to try to be somewhere safe. Yeah. What's that level of unsafety like? There's a lot of gender-based violence throughout the book. It's one of the themes. I think we need an entire re-education of men, but with the hashtag #MeToo cabinet coming in, I don't find that happening anytime soon. But there's a chapter that goes into incarceral systems. It was a really big mind shift for me. I used to think longer prison terms were justified sometimes. And then after writing that chapter, I don't, but not the way our incarceral system works. We shouldn't have for-profit prisons. We need to realize that the restriction of freedom is a punishment. We don't need solitary confinement and terrible treatment to further punish people. We should be working to rehabilitate them, give them skills, and support them when they're out so they don't reoffend. Sweden's got is the carceral system that I talk about in the book. There are a lot of great lessons to be learned. I'd love to shift some people's perspectives on prison sentencing. On camps, refugee camps, just, really, anytime you see people in a temporary settlement or temporary living conditions doesn't mean it's a refugee camp with tons of access to resources. Sometimes it can be a settlement where, people have to pay for their tent. It's basically the government granting the land.
Yeah.
And then there's an overseer, and it's not easy. I feel like even now as we listen to, Jabalia refugee camp, and then people see like cement on the ground and they can't understand. They think it's a camp, like a tent, and they don't realize that generations have been displaced since Nakba, and they're living in a way where they don't have full freedom and opportunity. So I'd like the book to maybe have people question what they assume they know. It'd be lovely if we could have discourse. It's even greater if we could pester our political leaders to have change. Or maybe just even motivate ourselves to maybe volunteer or give money or get involved or educate ourselves or have a discussion with someone who thinks completely differently than we do to kind of reduce the polarization and increase social cohesion at a time where this country is really divided. And there's a chapter where I fault political hubris of a political leader that led to like a very small and short war, but not to the people who lost family members in it in Kurdistan. And this hubris of political leadership when they don't think through rollout or execution. And I'm thinking very specifically in this country of reproductive health care and the removal of those rights without thinking through what that would mean to women who wanted their pregnancies to be successful but experienced emergencies in pregnancies. Because 5 women died in Texas for this reason last year. Because we've criminalized health in a way that no one thought it through. They just were in a hurry to like abolish this right to show that they could. And so that hubris and political leadership and the danger of it and the bad decision making, and then how those decisions reverberate in people's lives. I'd love there a little more awareness around that. It's a tiny part of the memoir, but it's there a little bit. And then, like when institutions care more about their reputation than they care about safety in a public way. There is a friend who died from drugs that he took knowingly, but there was always this question if the drugs were laced or skanked or fentanyl, I don't know. And to my knowledge, there never was a toxicology report, and it was, tried to keep kind of quiet. And I think that was a huge disservice to the community within which we were a part. So those are some of the things that like those in charge, people who make decisions to think about, and us who elect those people to think about.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation and everything you just mentioned and what I had said earlier, where you are a great teacher in the way that you relate to people. And so I truly do. And I haven't read the book, but just this conversation and hearing about it, I truly do believe that your story and your stories are going to change the world in many ways. So thank you. I can personally say that you solidified my mission and my career, but just life mission in general and my values and what I believe in. And where I hope to be, and I truly look up to you. So thank you, and yeah, please check out Breakfast Wine. Pre-order Breakfast Wine. Yes, beautiful. All
Thank you
right.
so much, Kayla. I really appreciate your having me. Thank you so very much for wanting to support me in my work. I'm really very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.